Kyle Rittenhouse was acquitted on all charges today, and I just pulled up some articles that were published almost immediately, which indicates that they were written beforehand because they anticipated a not guilty verdict. Correctly, they should have. So I'm just going to start with this one by MSN. This is just to illustrate how far removed from the truth, willfully so. They know that they're lying when they say these things. The fact that they were saying this stuff before the trial is one thing. They were trying to influence politics. They were trying to influence the social idea of self-defense and the media presentation of the riots, the arsons, just the absolute lawlessness of last year. And so the individuals such as Kyle Rittenhouse, who stood in opposition to that, are to be demonized. Well, now that we've seen all the trial footage, presumably individuals who write these things, such as Glenn Kirschner here, are aware of what was presented during the trial. They now should be able to tell a truthful and honest story, no matter how biased. And yet they still tell lies. They still repeat the same lies. I'm going to give you some examples. The very first paragraph talks about the judge having played a role in the not guilty verdict to rule that the prosecutors could not refer to the three men as victims, but that the defense attorneys would refer to them as looters, rioters, and arsonists. Whether they were looters, rioters, or arsonists is irrelevant. Those things don't really have any bearing on whether or not Rittenhouse was guilty. They could have been rioters, looters, and arsonists, and the evidence is in that that's exactly what they were. So those are descriptors of things that they actually were versus them being victims, which is contingent upon whether or not Kyle Rittenhouse was guilty of murder. So they're not victims. That's not a factual statement. Looters, rioters, and arsonists is a factual statement because these men did loot and riot and commit arson. Now, though Rittenhouse's victims were white, there are others who label him as a young racist. Based on what? Others. What others? Others being people who have no evidence whatsoever for calling him a racist, but do anyway? With an itchy trigger finger. Really? Because he only shot the people who were trying to kill him and nobody else. I don't call that somebody with an itchy trigger finger. Yeah, but that's what others have labeled him. Well, they're wrong. Why give them any credence? Anybody who says something like that. Only the jurors know why they had reasonable doubt about Rittenhouse's guilt. No, not only the jurors. Anybody who watched the trial and looked at it objectively knows why, not only the jurors. Let's hope the jury's decision was based exclusively on the evidence introduced during the trial. Well, I guess that's all we can do. All we can do is hope, all right? The American legal system and Wisconsin state law gives defendants a huge advantage in shootings such as these. Prosecutors must prove that the armed aggressors overreacted when using lethal force. More specifically, prosecutors are required to disprove self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt. So are you just trying to be informative or are you complaining? Because you have to prove someone's guilt, especially in something as consequential as this. Murder versus self-defense. Yes, you must prove that the person who is claiming self-defense was not actually defending themselves, that they are actually responsible for killing somebody. Maybe he's just trying to be informative. A huge advantage. Yes, a huge advantage. Well, because there needs to be. If there weren't a huge advantage, then you'd have all kinds of people going to prison for things that they shouldn't be going to prison for. Often, as was the case here, prosecutors don't succeed. Moreover, there are times prosecutors decline to even bring criminal charges, apparently believing a trial would be futile, inevitably resulting in an acquittal. As was the case here, this never should have been brought to trial. They know that the trial would be futile because they know that there is no evidence supporting their prosecution. And there is a mountain of evidence supporting the defense. It was futile. The only reason why you wouldn't think it was futile, they will be found guilty because of the social circumstances surrounding the trial. You hope that the mob gets their way and not the law. It's a deadly cycle that seems to have America in its grips. Yes, that's the deadly cycle. The fact that innocent people have the advantage. And by consequence, guilty people have an advantage. And in a system where we have the right to self-defense, that's okay. Because guilty people will be less likely to get away with it if the person that they are trying to harm in some way is able to defend themselves. One can't help but feel that we are forever sacrificing the lives of men and women, boys and girls, in our country's determination to worship at the altar of unrestricted gun rights. Well, our gun rights are not unrestricted. They're heavily restricted. But not to the degree that you can't defend yourself against people who are trying to kill you with a gun. Which is what happened here. As we watched the trial unfold on television, we learned that two of Rittenhouse's victims were unarmed. One was unarmed. though he was the one was holding a skateboard, he reportedly swung at Rittenhouse. Reportedly, it was on video. So he wasn't unarmed. He had a weapon. A skateboard is not designed to be a weapon, but neither is a baseball bat. A baseball bat is designed to hit a baseball, but it certainly can be used as a weapon, can't it? And there is video of a guy who was assaulted during the riots last year, who was hit with a skateboard, and his head was caved in. The third victim had a gun but did not fire it at Rittenhouse? Yes, because Rittenhouse fired it first. How can Rittenhouse be justified in shooting 3 protesters, killing 2 of them under those circumstances? Well, are they immune from being shot and killed because they were protesting? In many criminal cases I've tried, so he's a lawyer. He's a lawyer, and he's criticizing the preponderance of evidence being on the state to convict somebody beyond a reasonable doubt. He is critical of the fact that innocent people are more likely to get off by virtue of the fact that it's more difficult to prove somebody is guilty of a crime. He's a prosecutor. In many criminal cases I've tried, defense attorney, so that's not him. So this prosecutor is unhappy with the fact that he has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Regardless of how we may feel about the result, born of politics, tribalism, sympathy, or antipathy for one party or another, we must accept the jury's verdict. But it does raise questions about the wisdom of unrestricted gun access. We don't have unrestricted gun access in this country. Despite the fact that the Second Amendment says we should, we don't. There are so many laws preventing us from having guns. And the way self-defense is defined in this country, especially when the fight is seemingly hopelessly lopsided. Now, what are you referencing here? The fight with Kyle Rittenhouse having an AR-15 versus 3 men, one with a .40 caliber Glock, one with a skateboard, and one an absolute psycho pedophile in a situation of total chaos and darkness where he's being chased by dozens of people. It's lopsided because he had an AR-15. Moving on to the next one. MSNBC. Actually, I'm going to save this one for last because this is absolutely ridiculous. All right, from Huffington Post. Rittenhouse first shot and killed 36-year-old Joseph Rosenbaum, who was unarmed and chasing Rittenhouse during a confrontation. Video played at the trial showed. That is fact. That is fact. It's leaving out a few things. For instance, that this guy was an absolute psycho, a pedophile, who had just gotten out of a mental institution that day, who threatened to kill Rittenhouse, and who was shot with his hand on the barrel of the gun that he was trying to take from him. I guess those facts aren't relevant. They were relevant to the jury. Former Marine Jason Lakowski testified during the trial that he was with Rittenhouse earlier that night and also armed with an AR-15 style rifle, but did not see Rosenbaum as a threat. Well, that was you. He wasn't chasing you and trying to take your gun. If that were happening, would you have seen him as a threat then? Rittenhouse also shot paramedic Gage Grosskreutz. He testified that his arms were raised in surrender when Rittenhouse shot him. No, he testified that he pointed the gun at Rittenhouse, and that's when he was shot. This is false. He said his arms were raised at one point, but under intense questioning, he admitted that he was pointing the gun at him. And the video evidence shows that. It shows him pointing his Glock 40 caliber pistol at Rittenhouse at the moment he was getting shot. So it says he got shot before he could shoot him. And he also said that he wasn't intending to shoot him. The only reason why you didn't shoot him is because he shot you first. Schroeder also picked a jury in just one day in what the New York Times described as an unusually swift process. Well, first of all, Schroeder didn't pick the jury. It's a process that picks the jury. And what the New York Times described as an unusually swift process that resulted in an overwhelmingly white jury. Exactly how did the swiftness of the process result in an overwhelmingly white jury? If it had been slower, it wouldn't have been overwhelmingly white, and how would that have happened? Days later, a juror was dismissed after making a racist joke about Blake. Well, it sounds to me like the overall potential racist attitudes of the jury was reduced by that fact. Moving on. This is MSNBC. Kyle Rittenhouse, who fatally shot 2 protesters and wounded a third during anti-police brutality demonstrations in Wisconsin last year, has been found not guilty of homicide. An outrageous yet unsurprising verdict in a trial marred by controversy. All right, first of all, he shot 2 protesters. Protesters. These guys were whatever they were doing, if they were involved in protesters, they weren't protesting when Kyle Rittenhouse had to defend himself against their attacks. The facts do not matter to these people. He's been found not guilty of homicide, an outrageous yet unsurprising verdict marred by controversy. Well, the controversy surrounding the trial has to do with the fact that the prosecution was withholding evidence, manipulating evidence, and then just the way that the media has been doing things, the protests outside with the threats by people like George Floyd's cousin saying, we know who these jurors are and where they live. Believe me, there are people who are taking photos of them. I'm not quoting him, that's essentially what was being said. MSNBC themselves, one of their reporters, it has something to do with the jurors being followed. This could have been dismissed with prejudice. Anyhow, yeah, these are the types of controversies, but that's not obviously what he's talking about. There's a link here, I'm not going to click it right now, but Rittenhouse, who is white, okay, yeah, he shot dead Joseph Rosenbaum, Anthony Huber, and wounded Gage Grosskreutz. Does not mention that they're white, just that he's white. He traveled from his hometown in northeast Illinois to the protests in Kenosha, Wisconsin last year armed with his semi-automatic rifle. No, he didn't. He didn't travel armed with a semi-automatic rifle. He picked up his rifle in Kenosha, where his family lives, where he works, from what I understand. He carried his gun through the streets. He carried his gun just like this fellow here, Gage Grosskreutz, carried his gun. The difference between these two is that Gage Grosskreutz was carrying his gun illegally. Rittenhouse was carrying his gun legally because it was a dangerous situation. Now, if you're going to try and argue that he shouldn't have been out there with a gun, well, then who should be out there? Nobody? Because the cops sure as hell weren't out there. They were burning down the city, and he was there to help out with defending property from rioters who were burning and looting and destroying everything. He was providing medical aid because he was trained in first aid. He was a lifeguard. And he was cleaning off graffiti. He was putting out fires with a fire extinguisher. Case had the makings of an acquittal before the trial even began, it says here. Yeah, in the sense that the charges never even should have been brought against him. It was clearly self-defense from the start, so it had the makings of an acquittal. It never should have been a trial in the first place. Now, the outcome, he says, is it seemed quite clear even before an almost exclusively white jury pool was selected. The jury is selected randomly from the community. What do you want? Whatever your name is, Jahan Jones, unless you think that this was somehow rigged. Things get rigged in Wisconsin, I know. Even before Judge Bruce Schroeder created an uproar by ruling that slain protesters could be referred to as rioters and looters because they were. They're shown on camera doing these things, but not victims, but because that prejudices the jury against the defendant if you call the people who he is being accused of having killed as his victims, as opposed to them being the attackers and him being the defender, which is what the jury has decided, rightfully so, based upon all the evidence, the video evidence, the overwhelming evidence, including the testimony of the so-called victims, as you want them to be called. Gage Grosskreutz, yeah, he shot me when I pointed my loaded .40 cal Glock at him. You want him to be referred to as a victim. Schroeder refused to punish Rittenhouse for what prosecutors said amounted to a violation of his bond conditions. Prosecutors said that he murdered these people. Prosecutors say that he violated his bond conditions, and so you're mad that Judge Schroeder didn't take their word for it? That he just did it just because, screw you guys, I'm already on Rittenhouse's side. The idea that he violated his bond conditions, it must be true because the prosecution said that he did? Rittenhouse is a white teen who abides by white rules. What white rules are these? Because the laws of the country is what he abided by. If you call those white rules, which I guess you do, well, the white rules are that you can defend yourself when someone's trying to kill you. Those are the rules he abided by. The rules that he abided by say that you can protect people's property, that you can resist chaos and lawlessness in the streets. Those are the rules. Are those white rules? Because if they're white rules only, then what are you saying about non-white rules? That non-white rules are do whatever you want, white people empathetic to those rules, or all people empathetic to those rules seem poised to insulate him from repercussions. Yes, you want to insulate people who do the right thing from being punished. That's insulating him from repercussions. Sure, I'll give you that. Repercussions, undeserved repercussions. Day he pleaded not guilty to felony homicide. Rittenhouse flashed a white supremacist symbol. I assume you mean the OK symbol. You're an idiot. loudly serenaded by a group of men at a bar. What does that have to do with him? Whoever they're associated with the Proud Boys, a far-right extremist group, according to prosecutors. What do men at a bar who have far right-wing associations have to do with the guilt or innocence of the defendant here, according to prosecutors? Law enforcement, including a department known to cover up its own lawless acts of violence, what that has to do with Rittenhouse's guilt, I have no idea, seem to give cover to Rittenhouse from the get-go. Seem to. Okay, well, I don't know. In what way? No details there. With these endorsements, white conservatives felt all the more comfortable swaddling Rittenhouse in the protection they often give to police and vigilantes serving white conservative interests. Their support is a physical threat to people supporting those policies. Supporting policies like burning down buildings? Yeah, it's a physical threat. Well, it needs to be some kind of a threat to people. People like you who apparently think that that's all okay. Maybe not a physical threat, but if you are going to physically threaten, going to intimidate people, intimidate juries, to try to take law outside of the legal system and into the hands of the mob, then yes, you do need to be physically threatened. Because you are a physical threat. Self-defense means you can defend yourself against physical threats. And that is what rioters, not the protesters, the rioters, the looters, the arsonists, that is what they represented. Conservatives are encouraging white vigilantes like Rittenhouse to police progressive spaces by all means. No, left-wing progressives like you are encouraging white vigilantes because you are the ones who are attempting to hamstring the lawful actions of police. If the police can't do the job, then people, conservative or otherwise, white or otherwise, they're going to defend themselves and their property and their livelihoods. Because you want the police to stand down because of the injustice and the brutality that at times are rightly illustrated by what happens throughout the country. We have seen it. We're aware of it. But your answer is to completely dismantle the system of protection that we endow the police with. And you want to take that away, and then you want to bitch and complain when average, everyday citizens step in to fill the void. You want chaos. You want destruction. This is evil. It's just absolutely abhorrent. And you, sir, I use that word very loosely, are an abhorrent, evil individual. And if you think you're going to one day be able to stand in front of somebody, some spirit, God or something, and be able to defend yourself because you say, well, I just didn't know. Well, you've been told. And you will have no place to defend yourself because it will be pointed out to you and you decided to continue on in this way anyway. One day you will be judged. Whether it's karma, the universe, something. You will be judged and you will be found lacking. Thank God. Thank God Kyle Rittenhouse was found not guilty. Because what it would have meant if he were found guilty is that you have no right to defend yourself anymore. Give the mob all the power. Let them rule. Because this system of governance that we have, which is being systematically dismantled every single day by people like you, that's all we've got. That's all we've got to hold on to. You want to call that conservatism? Well, in fact it is. That is by definition conservatism. The fact that conservatism is now, we want to have laws, shows you how far you have gone on the left. Thank God Rittenhouse was acquitted. Because it shows that we do still have the ability to defend ourselves against people like you. And believe me, we will.